She stood at the front desk with her back straight and her hands folded, the way her mother taught her to stand when she wanted to be taken seriously in a room that had already decided not to take her seriously. The young man behind the counter did not look up right away. When he finally did, his eyes moved over her only once before he said the room she had booked online did not exist in his system, and there was nothing available tonight, not a single room. The hotel was full. Behind her, a white couple stepped up with no reservation at all, and within 90 seconds, they were handed 2 key cards and a smile. She watched it happen without saying a word, because she already knew something none of them in that lobby knew yet. Her name was on a document upstairs in a locked drawer, a document that said she owned nearly half of the building they were all standing inside of. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Her name was Regina Calloway, and by the time this night was over, the people who had just turned her away in her own lobby would understand exactly who they had been speaking to. But right now, in this moment, none of them had any idea. The manager on duty, a man named Bradley Whitfield, had worked at this hotel for 11 years and considered himself a good judge of who belonged and who didn't. A skill he had never once had to defend out loud, because no one had ever asked him to. He didn't know that the woman he had just dismissed with a shrug had sat on the other side of a negotiating table 18 months earlier, reviewing balance sheets with the very ownership group that signed his paychecks. He didn't know that her signature was one of 4 required to approve the hotel's annual budget. He only knew what he thought he saw when she walked through the door, and he had made his decision before she ever opened her mouth. There were 3 questions hanging over this hotel lobby that night, and every person in it would eventually have to answer at least one of them. The first was simple. Did Regina Calloway know, in that exact moment, that she was being lied to, or did she genuinely believe there was no room? The second question was harder. How many other guests had stood in that same spot, in front of that same desk, and been told the same lie, without the power to ever prove it? And the third question, the one that would matter most by the end of this story, was what a woman does with quiet, documented power once she finally decides to use it. Regina did not raise her voice. She did not ask to speak to a manager, because the man lying to her already held that title. She simply turned, walked back through the revolving door, and got into her car. To understand why that lobby moment carried the weight it did, you have to go back nearly 20 years. To a much smaller building on the south side of Atlanta, where a 19-year-old Regina Calloway worked the night shift at a budget motel off the interstate, cleaning rooms before sunrise and manning the front desk after school. Her mother worked 2 jobs, and her father had left when Regina was 11, so the motel became something close to a second family, run by an older man named Otis Reginald Marsh, who had built the small property from nothing after being denied a bank loan 7 separate times. Otis saw something in Regina that most people overlooked, a sharpness in the way she handled difficult guests, a patience that never curdled into resentment, and a habit of noticing details that made operations run smoother without anyone asking her to. He started teaching her the business side quietly, after hours, using his own ledgers as a textbook. By the time Regina turned 25, she had worked her way through community college, then a state university business program, taking night classes while managing front-of-house operations for a mid-sized hotel chain during the day. She was good at the job in a way that made her superiors uncomfortable, because she asked questions about revenue management and occupancy strategy that most entry-level managers never thought to ask. She was passed over for 2 promotions in a row, both times watching less experienced colleagues, always white, always men, step into roles she had effectively been training for without the title. She did not complain loudly or file grievances, because Otis had taught her something else during those late nights at the motel, that the people who make the most noise rarely end up owning anything, and the people who own something rarely have to make noise at all. Otis passed away when Regina was 31, and in his will, he left her a modest inheritance, along with something far more valuable, an introduction to a small private investment group he had quietly belonged to for over a decade, a group of Black professionals who pooled resources to buy stakes in commercial real estate that had historically excluded them as guests, let alone as owners. Regina used her inheritance as her entry stake, and over the following 9 years, she reinvested every dividend, every bonus, every dollar she could set aside, slowly increasing her position in the group's portfolio. She kept her involvement private, partly out of humility and partly out of strategy, because she had learned that being underestimated was sometimes the most useful position a person could occupy in a negotiation. The property that would eventually consume her attention more than any other was a grand, century-old hotel in downtown Charleston, a building with marble columns and a lobby chandelier that had been photographed for travel magazines since the 1960s. A hotel that had, in fact, refused black guests entirely until federal law forced its doors open in the following decade. The irony was not lost on Regina when the investment group first identified the property as undervalued and ripe for acquisition. The original ownership family was aging out, eager to sell, and Regina's group assembled the capital to acquire a controlling interest, with Regina personally holding just under 40% of the equity by the time the deal closed. She insisted on one condition during the negotiation that surprised even her own partners. She did not want her name attached publicly to the ownership records, at least not yet, and she did not want the existing staff informed of the change in leadership beyond the legal minimum required. Her partners questioned the decision, but Regina had her reasons rooted in almost 2 decades of watching how people behaved when they believed no one of consequence was watching. She wanted to see the hotel as it actually operated, not as it performed for someone it knew held power. She began visiting the property periodically under an assumed corporate travel booking, never announcing her ownership stake, dressing well but not ostentatiously, and simply observing how the staff treated different types of guests. For the first 2 visits, everything appeared professional on the surface. Courteous smiles, efficient check-ins, the kind of hospitality that photographs well for a marketing brochure. It was only on her 3rd visit, nearly a year after the acquisition closed, that the cracks began to show themselves, though at the time she chalked it up to a single unfortunate encounter rather than a pattern. That 3rd visit involved a different front desk clerk than the one who would later turn her away. A young woman who kept Regina waiting nearly 15 minutes while assisting 2 other guests who had arrived after her, guests who happened to be white, before finally processing her reservation with a curtness that bordered on rudeness. Regina said nothing at the time, filed the memory away, and continued monitoring the property from a distance through her partner's quarterly operational reports. Reports that conspicuously never mentioned any customer service concerns, any discrimination complaints, any pattern worth flagging. She began to suspect that whatever was happening at street level in that lobby was not making its way up through the reporting structure, either because no one was tracking it or because someone along the chain was deliberately keeping it buried. She decided, without telling her partners, to start documenting things herself. Over the following 14 months, Regina made 6 more unannounced visits to the Charleston property, staying under corporate booking codes that obscured her real identity, and each time she brought with her a small notebook where she recorded times, names, and specific details of every interaction she witnessed, not just her own, but those of other guests around her in the lobby, in the elevator bank, and in the restaurant downstairs. She noticed that black guests were disproportionately asked for additional identification at check-in. She noticed that room upgrades seemed to flow more freely toward guests who did not resemble her. She noticed that complaints filed by black guests at the front desk rarely appeared in the official guest relations log that her partners reviewed each quarter, as though someone was quietly filtering out the entries before they ever reached ownership. The pattern was becoming difficult to ignore, but she still did not have enough to act on. Not yet. Not in a way that would hold up if the staff simply denied everything. The general manager of the property, a polished and well-connected man named Richard Ellsworth, had run the hotel for 6 years by the time Regina's group acquired it, and he had successfully convinced the new owners during the transition period that the property's staff was one of the best-trained teams in the region, citing customer satisfaction scores that, on paper, looked impressive. What Regina slowly came to understand was that those scores were curated, drawn heavily from surveys sent to guests who had checked in without incident, while guests who left dissatisfied, guests who felt they had been treated unfairly, were quietly excluded from the survey pool through a filtering system Ellsworth had implemented years earlier, under the guise of reducing what he called irrelevant feedback. It was an elegant, almost invisible way to make a discriminatory pattern disappear from every metric that mattered to the people funding the operation. Bradley Whitfield, the front desk manager who would eventually turn Regina away entirely, had been hired by Ellsworth 4 years earlier, promoted twice under his mentorship, despite 2 separate written complaints from guests, alleging he had treated them differently based on race, complaints that Ellsworth had personally reviewed and dismissed as isolated misunderstandings, rather than escalating them to ownership or human resources. Bradley had absorbed, whether consciously or not, an understanding of who counted as a valuable guest and who did not, an understanding shaped less by explicit instruction and more by the culture Ellsworth had cultivated at the property, a culture where certain assumptions about class and race were never spoken aloud, but were nonetheless deeply understood by everyone working the floor. This was the environment Regina walked into on the night she was turned away, though she did not yet know the full architecture of what she was dealing with. The night of the incident began ordinarily enough. Regina had flown into Charleston for what she told her staff was a routine site visit, though she had specifically chosen to arrive during a period when Ellsworth was scheduled to be off-property at an industry conference, wanting to see how the hotel functioned under Bradley's direct authority, without the general manager present to manage appearances. She checked her reservation twice before leaving the airport, confirmed the booking confirmation number, and arrived at the hotel a little after 8 in the evening, dressed in a simple tailored suit, carrying a single overnight bag, looking, by any reasonable measure, like exactly what she was, a successful professional traveling for business. She approached the front desk and gave her name, expecting the routine exchange of a key card and a room number that had defined hundreds of hotel check-ins throughout her career. Bradley Whitfield looked at his screen, then looked at Regina, then looked back at his screen for slightly longer than the transaction should have required. He told her there appeared to be an issue with the reservation, that the system showed no availability for the night despite her confirmation number, and that he was very sorry but there was simply nothing he could do. Regina asked him to check again, calmly, without any edge in her voice, and he repeated the same explanation with a practiced smoothness that suggested he had delivered this particular line before. It was at that moment that the couple arrived behind her, a white man and woman in casual travel clothes, no visible luggage beyond a single tote bag, and Bradley greeted them warmly, processed a walk-in reservation in under 2 minutes, and handed them 2 key cards with a smile that had been entirely absent during his exchange with Regina. She stood there for a moment longer, watching the couple walk toward the elevator, watching Bradley return his attention to his computer screen as though the previous exchange had never happened, and she felt something she had felt many times before in her life, but had rarely had the power to actually do anything about. This time was different, and she knew it, though she did not let a single flicker of that knowledge show on her face. She thanked Bradley for his time, turned, and walked out through the same revolving door she had entered through minutes earlier, got into a rideshare, and sat in the back seat pulling out her phone before the car had even left the hotel's circular driveway. She was not calling a friend to vent. She was calling her attorney, and then her lead partner in the investment group, and then, finally, a woman named Denise Okafor, the hotel's overnight housekeeping supervisor, whose name Regina had quietly collected during her earlier visits as someone worth talking to. Denise had worked at the hotel for nearly 9 years, longer than almost anyone on staff besides Ellsworth himself, and she had seen the pattern Regina suspected long before Regina ever set foot in the building as an owner. Denise had watched housekeeping staff, most of whom were Black and Latino women, get assigned the heaviest workloads with the least recognition, while front-of-house positions with public visibility and better tips skewed disproportionately toward staff who fit a certain image Ellsworth apparently believed the hotel's clientele preferred. She had filed an internal complaint about scheduling discrimination 2 years earlier, a complaint that vanished into the same administrative void that swallowed guest complaints, and she had quietly begun keeping her own records after that. Dates, names, incidents, screenshots of scheduling software before entries were altered. When Regina reached out that night, identifying herself honestly for the first time as a part owner of the property, Denise did not hang up the phone, and she did not hesitate. She said she had been waiting 9 years for someone with actual power to ask her what she knew. Over the next several days, working quietly with her attorney and 2 trusted members of her investment group, Regina began assembling a case that extended far beyond the single incident at the front desk. Denise provided internal scheduling records, showing a clear pattern of assignment disparities along racial lines. A former front desk employee, who had been quietly pushed out 18 months earlier after raising concerns about guest treatment, agreed to give a sworn statement describing specific instances where Ellsworth had instructed staff to prioritize certain guests over others, using coded language that avoided explicit racial terms, but left no ambiguity about the intent. Regina's own notebook, filled with 14 months of dates and observations, provided a timeline that corroborated everything the 2 employees described. What had started as an isolated encounter at a front desk was revealing itself to be a structural problem embedded in how the hotel had been run for years, possibly longer than Regina's ownership group had even held their stake. Word began to move through the hotel that something was happening, though most of the staff, including Bradley, had no idea what specifically was under investigation or who was driving it. Ellsworth, still unaware that Regina was connected to ownership, noticed his lead investors requesting an unusual number of internal reports over a short span of days. Reports on guest complaint handling, on survey methodology, on staff scheduling practices going back 3 years. He grew uneasy without knowing exactly why, and in a decision that would later prove to be a significant miscalculation, he reached out to a minority investor in the ownership group named Douglas Kane, a man who had opposed the original acquisition of the Charleston property and had been quietly looking for an opportunity to force a buyout of the more community-oriented partners, including Regina, whose growing influence within the group he viewed as a threat to his preferred, more conventional approach to hospitality management. Douglas Kane saw an opportunity in Ellsworth's nervous inquiry. If he could frame the emerging situation not as a discrimination scandal but as a broader operational failure under the current ownership structure, he believed he could use the resulting instability to pressure Regina and her allies into selling their stakes at a depressed valuation, allowing him and a group of like-minded investors to take full control of the property. He began making quiet calls of his own, suggesting to other passive investors that the hotel's management troubles reflected poorly on the entire ownership group's judgment, carefully avoiding any specific mention of what those troubles actually were, since he did not yet know the details himself. It was a calculated bet, one built on the assumption that confusion and fear would move faster through the investor group than facts, and for a few days, it appeared to be working, as several smaller stakeholders began asking Regina's lead partner pointed questions about the property's stability. What Douglas Kane did not know, and what Ellsworth certainly did not know, was that Regina had already scheduled an emergency meeting of the full ownership group for the following week. Not to defend against rumors, but to present the complete findings of her investigation, backed by sworn statements, internal records, and her own documented history of visits to the property. She had also, in the days leading up to that meeting, done something neither Ellsworth nor Bradley Whitfield had any reason to anticipate. She booked one more reservation at the hotel, this time under her own name, with no attempt at concealment, arriving on a Thursday evening exactly 2 weeks after the night she had first been turned away, walking through the same revolving door, approaching the same front desk, where Bradley Whitfield happened to be working the exact same shift. Bradley did not recognize her at first. Not truly. Not until she stated her name clearly and watched the color drain slowly from his face as the system pulled up her reservation, this time flagged with an internal ownership designation that had been quietly added to her guest profile earlier that afternoon by Regina's attorney working with the hotel's corporate systems team. Bradley stammered an apology that had nothing specific to apologize for yet, some instinctive recognition that something had gone deeply wrong, though he could not have said exactly what. Regina simply asked him, calmly, to call Richard Ellsworth and inform him that the property's 40% owner was standing in the lobby and would like to speak with him immediately regarding an urgent matter. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The silence that followed as Bradley picked up the phone with visibly shaking hands told her everything about how thoroughly the moment had landed. Ellsworth arrived at the hotel less than 30 minutes later, having cut short a dinner engagement, his composure noticeably strained as he crossed the lobby toward Regina, extending a hand she did not immediately take. She informed him, in the same measured tone she had used with Bradley, that she would be presenting a full account of the property's guest treatment practices to the entire ownership group in 8 days, and that she wanted to give him the opportunity, out of professional courtesy, to review the specific findings beforehand so there would be no surprises in the room. What followed was not a confrontation filled with raised voices or dramatic accusations, but something far more uncomfortable for Ellsworth. A calm, methodical recitation of dates, names, and documented patterns that made it immediately clear this was not a single disgruntled guest lodging a complaint, but an owner who had spent over a year quietly building an irrefutable case. Ellsworth attempted, in the days that followed, to control the narrative internally, calling a staff meeting where he framed the upcoming ownership review as a routine operational audit, careful not to mention Regina by name or reveal the true nature of what had been uncovered. Bradley Whitfield, increasingly anxious, began to suspect that his own conduct might be at the center of whatever was unfolding, and in a moment of poor judgment that would later work against him, he attempted to alter the digital guest interaction log from the night he had turned Regina away, changing the recorded reason for the denied reservation from a vague system error to a fabricated note claiming the room had been double booked by an external travel agency. He did not know that Regina's attorney had already secured a preserved copy of the original system records days earlier, anticipating exactly this kind of after-the-fact alteration, a common enough tactic that experienced investigators know to guard against before an investigation is ever announced. The emergency ownership meeting took place 8 days later in a conference room on the hotel's top floor, a room with the same view of the Charleston harbor that had been used for decades to impress prospective investors and business partners. Regina walked the group through her findings methodically, presenting Denise Okafor's scheduling records, the sworn statement from the former front desk employee, her own 14 months of documented visits, and finally the preserved system logs proving Bradley's attempted alteration of the guest interaction record. Douglas Kane, who had spent the preceding week quietly lobbying other investors toward a buyout narrative, sat largely silent through the presentation, his earlier framing of instability now looking dramatically different in light of what the evidence actually showed. An evidence trail that made clear the instability had been present in the hotel's operations long before Regina ever raised concerns, and that his own attempt to exploit the situation for a cheap buyout now looked, to the rest of the group, considerably more self-serving than protective. By the end of that meeting, the ownership group voted unanimously, including a visibly chastened Douglas Kane, to terminate Richard Ellsworth's employment, effective immediately, citing not just his failure to address known discrimination complaints, but his active suppression of the evidence that would have revealed the pattern years earlier. Bradley Whitfield was terminated the same week, following a separate internal review that confirmed his attempt to falsify records, a decision the group agreed was necessary, regardless of how much of his behavior had been shaped by the culture Ellsworth had cultivated around him. Denise Okafor, who had waited 9 years for someone with power to take her seriously, was promoted to a newly created Director of Guest Experience and Staff Equity position, a role designed specifically to ensure that the kind of filtering system Ellsworth had used to hide complaints could never operate undetected again. Regina Calloway did not stop there. In the months following the leadership change, she used her position within the ownership group to implement a mandatory, unfiltered guest feedback system across all properties the group held stakes in, one that could not be edited or curated by any single manager before reaching ownership review. She also quietly acquired a portion of the equity that Douglas Kane, facing pressure from the rest of the group after his failed maneuvering came to light, ultimately decided to sell, increasing her own stake in the investment group beyond the position she had held before any of this began. The hotel itself underwent a broader cultural review, with new hiring and training practices designed around the very patterns her documentation had exposed. patterns that had likely existed at the property for far longer than the 14 months she had personally witnessed. What makes this story difficult to sit with is not simply that discrimination happened in a hotel lobby, because stories like that have happened for generations and continue happening in ways both obvious and hidden. What makes it difficult is how close the truth came to staying buried entirely. How a filtering system, a curated survey, a quietly dismissed complaint can erase an entire pattern of mistreatment from every metric the people in power ever choose to look at. Regina Calloway only uncovered what she uncovered because she happened to hold the rare position of being both the target of the discrimination and the person with enough structural power to investigate it thoroughly, a combination that almost never occurs in real life, which raises an uncomfortable question worth sitting with. How many hotels, how many businesses, how many front desks across this country are running the exact same filtering systems right now, hiding the exact same patterns, with no owner like Regina ever walking through the door to notice? Richard Ellsworth never publicly commented on his termination beyond a brief statement citing personal reasons for his departure, framing the ownership group allowed to stand publicly while ensuring every future hotel executive who called for a reference understood exactly why he had actually been let go. Bradley Whitfield struggled to find comparable work in hospitality afterward, a fact some might view as justice served, and others might view as evidence that individual accountability rarely touches the systems that shape a person's behavior in the first place. Douglas Kane remained in the investment group in a diminished role, having lost both equity and standing among his partners, a quiet consequence that never made headlines but reshaped the internal balance of power for years afterward. And Denise Okafor, the woman who had waited 9 years to be believed, still works at that hotel today, now with the authority to ensure that no complaint filed under her watch ever disappears the way hers once did. So here is the question worth leaving you with tonight. If Regina Calloway had not happened to be a part owner, if she had simply been a guest with no leverage beyond her own word against a manager's denial, would anyone have ever believed her? And would anything have ever changed at that hotel at all? Would you have spotted the pattern the way Denise did, quietly, for years, without anyone in power ever asking? And what does it say about how dignity gets rationed in this country? That it so often takes ownership, documentation, and a lawyer on retainer just to be treated the way anyone should be treated the moment they walk through a door. If this story moved you, tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and let us know what you would have done standing in Regina's shoes at that front desk. And if you thought this story was hard to sit with, wait until you hear what happened when a black family tried to check into a resort they had booked for a family reunion, only to discover the reservation had been quietly reassigned the moment the front desk saw who was walking through the door. Subscribe now so you never miss that story, or any of the real accounts of power, pride, and reckoning we bring you here every week.